Okay, so now let's do the second part of this. Let's actually define and call a function. And functions are one of those fundamental things in JavaScript that you'll see all the time. So understanding them is really important. All right, so I already have my VS Code open. I've already put a couple of lines here for some documentation. So we're going to define and call this function that we're going to write. Now, when writing functions, there's a couple of ways. It's a couple of different what we call syntax ways to do it. But I'm typically going to start with what we call a named traditional function, and then later we'll move to what is termed the arrow function, which is the new kid. I wouldn't even say it's a new kid on the block, but you'll see varieties of what I'm going to show you in arrow functions. And like I said, we'll start coding them later. So I'm going to set up a name of a variable. Okay, so in this case, handle, button, click. Okay, now in this case, unlike where we saw traditional variables where we assigned it, we're actually going to do an equal, but in this case, we're going to use the function keyword. Okay, open and close parentheses and an open and close brackets. So this is sometimes referred to as the function signature. So what will happen here is we're going to have a block of code. So this is now what we will term the block of code, whatever we write inside of here. And then in a moment, matter of fact, we'll just go ahead and have it in here. We'll call it. Okay. So if we were just looking at the pieces that need to be put together, we need to define a function, right? Tell it it is a function. Okay, give it an open and close parentheses, which we'll talk about why this is important here and why it's important here in a moment, and then give it a scope, curly brackets to define its scope. Now we talked about scope a little bit up here about that these are global, which means these variables, username and click and message, display, element, and update, are available anywhere in my code. But inside of the function itself, then we have a different kind of scope. We can reference what's out here on the global, but we can also set up variables that are only available inside of here, which is generally a better practice over time as you're writing code because you don't want too many things defined as variables out on the global. But we'll move to that as we handle more writing longer code. So let's say because the idea is when somebody clicks the button, right? So here, when somebody clicks the button, we're going to update some content, okay? And we're going to track those clicks and then respond to it in a particular way. So for now, though, we're not going to get all the way to that place. For now, we're just going to learn about these functions and how we call them and arguments and parameters. So let's start, though, with just saying click count equal. And now I'm going to write this in kind of the older style because you've already learned a new way to write this, but let's take whatever value is in the click count. So now we're referencing a global variable and we're going to say add one to it. So we know that this works, but we also know a new way of writing it. So the question would be, which is better? And the answer for a beginning coder is you write it in the way you understand it. Okay, so it's okay to have that one, but plus equals 1 does the same thing. And often when we're coding, we're trying to make things readable. So some might look at this and think that's not readable, but it is, depending on who you are, right? So let's now set up, now we're going to define a new variable called message. And in here, then we're going to do that template string we've been doing, right? We're going to just write out a message just so we can have some content to look at. We're going to reference by using this $sign. We're going to, I call it inject into here, the username. Okay, and then we're going to write some more content, right? So you have clicked the button, and now we'll tell it how many times. Okay, and then we'll do click count, and then some more content. Okay, period, and then semicolon. Okay, so now we've defined another variable, but this variable is only available to us inside of here at this point. And the way we're calling it and the way the function is handled, that's actually going to be the only place it's going to be available to us. And that's because, and we're not going to do it this time, but we would have to do something called a return in order to have that available to us later. Now, at this point, we're not going to do that. I'm just foreshadowing something you'll see later. But for now, let's go ahead and do console.log, right? And then now in this case, I could say button clicked, but it's not reflective of what we're doing, but it's building to the idea that you're going to click, okay, a button and have this happen. So we're just knowing that no, we're not clicking a button yet, okay, and then current click count. Remember, this message will end up being on the page, and this is on the console just so we can do some tracking to see how things get passed around and handled in JavaScript. Okay, all right. So now we have a little bit of content. Let's see, I do think I have a few pieces of, and we'll talk about that in a minute, template strings, right? So these two right here, right? So basically, here's what we've done, right? Is we have, right, message, and actually I think I'll move this one down to actually here, right? So I've shown you the old way of taking a beginning, whatever value it is, and adding something to it. I've also shown you the different kinds of operator. We've done the template strings, right? So now let's actually run this function. And this is a really important thing based on the way we've written it here to understand the way this function is called, because we're going to see it change even over the next lesson in here. Okay, so let's go to our console. Let's go to our sources. And by the way, anytime I'm doing this, you really should be following along, because understanding how to walk through and step through code is important. Now you can already see that, and I can, based on the console, that this has outputted the message that we had inside that function. Okay, so I'm just going to hit refresh just to show you it is happening. Okay, but kind of an interesting thing is here on the console, I actually could call that same function here, right on the console. And now what would happen? Well, now, right, it's calling it again. Right? And this time the click is 2, because once it ran, the first time it was 1, because it took 0, added 1 to it. Okay, so that's kind of a nice thing to understand, but there is also this undefined down here, and you might wonder what that is. And that's because of that return value that I was talking to you about before. Again, we'll revisit that later, but here's one of the things I highly recommend you get used to doing. Setting a breakpoint here. And what this will do is it'll, JavaScript is an interpreted language. What it'll do is once it is been set up in memory, it is going to run line by line. And so when I set a breakpoint, I hit refresh. At this point, notice how no content except this first console log has been outputted. So nothing in here, it's been set up like I could call it, right? But in my code, I got rid of my console. In my code, right, I'm sitting here waiting. So if I step, now I'm inside the function. Okay, so now inside, so when I hit step, now it called the function. And so now I'm at click +1. So by the way, notice if I roll over right now, because this is referencing what's out on the global. This is my function scope, okay? Because this line hasn't run, once it runs, once I hit step and it's now run, if I roll back over, you can see that is 1 now. And by the way, if you go over here, that's 1, because what we're doing is updating the value of that global. Okay, so now let's go here. So this message is only available to us, right, on this scope right here, on the function scope, okay? And so now this is now populated with that template string, and now we're going to run it again. Oh, sorry, go to the next step, and now we're done. Okay, again, you could let it run. And here we are back here, but we can see, and I was starting to type, which is why that was showing up. Okay, so how does this happen? Well, this happens just because when JavaScript loads, the JavaScript file in the process of the HTML starts to load, it hits the script tag, right? So if we were to come back over here and look in the head, we know that we've hit that script tag. We know we've deferred it to run until after the body got set up. That's what this defer did for us, right? So what happened is this function got run or called based on just JavaScript loading it. And oftentimes we want to control when things are ready, and we want to wait until that DOM is completely loaded. Because think about all the stuff that happens on a web page, right? There is so much. I mean, it's kind of mind-blowing in a way. But let's actually understand another piece of what can happen inside of a function, because this is a very basic function. We're not passing anything to it. And you might wonder, well, what does that mean to pass something to it? Well, let me give you an image here, right? So this graphic represents a function called sum. And in this case, inside of these parentheses, right, there's parameters. Well, those parameters come from when you call it, right? So we're calling the sum function. Now, this is a traditional function that's not named. I think starting naming things, because this has another issue around what we call hoisting. We're not going to worry about it today, but it's the same basic idea of we pass something to a function. And in this case, a 5, we pass a 5 and a 6. That becomes parm1 and parm2. Now, these we can name whatever we want. They're just variables that you're defining inside that will be used inside of this scope. And now we wouldn't actually put 5 here, because let's say we want to call that again later. We want to give it a different value, so we need to abstract that, what we're passing into a variable name. Now you might wonder, well, we're not doing a let or a const. No, but this is just the way the programming language handles this, and all of them do when we pass something in. Okay, so this is just a little bit of a preview, but let's actually play with this right now because it might be helpful. So like right now, we have defined username, right? And we have click count. And when we call this function, right, we're setting up some things and we're outputting some things, right? But I could pass a variable like that, 5, right? And then I could here, I wouldn't put that 5, I would put num, okay? Now, what I'm doing here, and I'm going to show you this in the console in a minute, right? Num. Okay, so let's actually go see this in action. Now let's set that breakpoint, right? Let's do this. And by the way, it had already run, which is great. We're going to step. And so right here, and this is why it's so important for you to do as I'm doing, because this is where you start to really understand how this code is actually doing what it's doing, because by just reading it, you can't always understand it, and especially for most of you that are new to this. So anyway, num. So in this case, we're passing 5, right? So this is, if we were to look at our graphic, right, these are our arguments that get passed in, they become parameters. But it's just a reference to, it's not, you're setting up a new variable inside of there is what I'm trying to show you, but it's just passing this and defining a variable that you use within this scope. Okay, so if we step through, right, it's doing the same thing. Now we're not using this number anywhere, but I'm just trying to show you the idea of arguments and parameters, because as we move forward, we will start doing this, and without having a basic understanding of what this is, it can be a little confusing. Okay, so let's go back to our code for now. And for now, we're just going to get rid of it, okay, because we're not going to use it, but I want you to understand it. Okay, so let me make sure I grabbed all of the comments that I had for this one, and I think I did. So in this case, the prompts you want to check out is explain JavaScript functions, right? How to define them and how and why they're useful. And boy, this couldn't be understated more. And then help me understand how arguments and parameters are used in functions, okay? These are two things that you want to start understanding about these basic functions, because we're getting ready to change this now to then start listening, right? So our next step in what we're going to do next is we're actually going to start wiring up, so to speak, or coding up that instead of just having this handled on the page load, right, on the JavaScript running the first time it comes to, we're going to set and listen for, because that's what you do when you interact with a web page. There's all this code waiting for you to click on something. It's listening, and then it will respond to you. Okay, I hope this helps.